The Lord of the Rings Return to Moria game just launched, and it's one of the rare new games that I was actually looking forward to the release of. And now I have had the chance to play for a few hours, and I'm just super excited to share some of my first impressions of the game and give you all my unique perspective with it. Return to Moria, or RTM for short, is a survival crafting adventure game set in the 4th age of the Lord of the Rings. So it's after the events of the War of the Ring, and it follows Tolkien lore, but it is not actually bound by the books or movies. I personally love the Lord of the Rings setting, and it means the game has, at least from my perspective, an inherently strong lore background and an interesting world to explore. The world you explore is basically Moria as a dwarf. You can select from a few different dwarf customization options, and you can choose a few of the different dwarf clans, and really, once you customize your dwarf, you can get ready to dig your way through Moria. As for the gameplay in RTM, first off, I personally come from a background of mostly MMORPGs and some regular RPGs as well, but I also have played Minecraft. That's really the closest thing in the genre to RTM that I have played. While I had avoided game spoilers of RTM before its launch, I expected that it wasn't quite going to be the sandbox world that Minecraft has and would perhaps put further emphasis on survival mechanics and, of course, fighting things like goblins, orcs, and trolls, and all the great evil that we all know and love of Moria. But speaking of Moria, my Lord of the Rings background is also mainly actually going to be from LOTRO, a Lord of the Rings MMORPG that has been out for actually about 16 and a half years, and it's the game that I have primarily covered on my channel here. While it is an entirely different genre, RTM and LOTRO have some commonalities in game mechanics, but they are just totally different genres, so I think it'll be interesting to compare them later. But speaking of my channel, did you know that the Epic Game Store that Return to Moria is on has a creator support program? So if you use my code Louis7 in the Epic Game Store, for example, if you purchase Return to Moria, that actually helps support my content and videos like this moving forward. I would really appreciate if you use my code if you make any purchases. Also, just to point out, I am going to try to avoid story spoilers, but of course I am going to show lots of gameplay here. Also, apologies for having my giant head here actually blocking some of the game. I did make some mistakes in my gameplay recording. Anyway, as someone who doesn't usually play dwarves in games, I tend towards elves, but I will say that I actually like the dwarf models. I guess it helps that there are really no alternatives here. That said, the customization options, especially for beards and faces, I have found to be a bit on the limited side. For me, I just kind of had to settle for like a decent enough option, which isn't really ideal. But more positively, it is a nice touch to be able to customize your dwarf's voice, origin, and even personality. It is important to note, though, that your dwarf is not actually tied to your game world, so if you do play multiplayer and join someone else's world, for example, you can do that with any dwarf you create. If you choose to open your own world and invite others, other players can also join with any of their dwarves, but importantly here, your inventory is tied to your dwarf, not the world, so you can actually bring things from your world to another player's world. With my only alternative being either Minecraft servers or Minecraft co-op worlds, I initially actually like this idea, and I have been utilizing it a little bit when I have played with a couple friends, but again, that playtime has been limited so far. But once you actually enter into your own world, you are greeted by a dark hall in Moria, and there are a few small fires around to light the way, but the game gives you a pretty basic tutorial here on how to do stuff. You do things like you pick up items, you craft a torch, you craft a pickaxe, you break some things with a pickaxe, you craft an axe, you break some goblins with the axe, and all that basic stuff with the game. But one of these first things in all of this that really impressed me was the fluidity of the movements. From a performance perspective, the game ran wonderfully on my PC. You can find my specs in the description, by the way, but the general character movements and combat were quite smooth. I wouldn't really expect a new game like this to not be smooth, but it is always a concern. The concern's always there, really. But the world immediately felt like it was actually intended to be broken down by mining and built in. But continuing on, the tutorials were quite helpful and actually very useful to actually pay attention to. I personally tend to prefer to wander around aimlessly, trying to discover stuff on my own, not really reading anything, but the tutorials were very valuable and ultimately did save time for me, especially when it came to the controls of the game and mechanics of just like building general things. Like there was the big hurdle of how do you even build a bedroll. Is super simple. You just open up the build menu with B. But anyway, there's things like that, even building a wall, a door, torches, and all that sort of general survival stuff that you need. But anyway, for combat, this is again my first game really in this kind of sector of the genre, so it took me a good minute to get used to the combat mechanics. It is somewhat similar, I discovered, to be similar to New World and actually Breath of the Wild, the Zelda game, but it is also different than those. It's its own thing, at least from my experience. Right now, I am enjoying the combat in general, but I will say there are a lot of enemies and a lot of respawns of goblins and wolves, at least early on in the game here. At this point, I don't know if spawn proofing is a thing like it is in Minecraft, but that is something that I would love to be able to do at this point. I admit I was taking actually my time to enjoy the discovery element, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but with this taking my time, it does mean that I was fighting the same things over and over and over again in the same area because they just kept respawning over and over again. And by about like 3 hours or so into the gameplay is when I really started to notice this, and I was starting to feel like the goblins and wolves were in particular getting a bit monotonous for me at that point. But now that we have covered some of the very basic mechanics and gotten those out of the way, I have to talk about the discovery element of this game. So I mentioned that I basically went into RTM blind and knowing very little about the gameplay and all of the mechanics. To me, uncovering the mystery of a game and discovering things on my own, like through my own gameplay, is really what makes adventure-based games, whether they're even like MMOs like LOTRO or survival games like RTM here, it just makes them so much more exciting to play. And honestly, it is a huge, huge part of the fun to me. It's really hard to understate the discovery and going it blind element to me. And for discovery, I'd like to actually first highlight the survival mechanics, which weren't all new to me. I had experienced a lot of these in other games, but even though I did have perhaps a few more embarrassing deaths, we'll say, that was actually part of the fun. I had fun dying because I discovered things. I discovered things like energy, stamina, hunger, health, light, and all these different debuffs like weariness, how they all work together for survival and not dying. I even quickly learned about like the important necessities like shelter, keeps you safe from goblins, and wolf invasions. Had I actually researched these things ahead of time, I think my progress would have been a whole lot faster in the game, and I probably would have gotten way further, delved deeper into Moria in the limited playtime that I have had, but that would have taken away the moments of discovery that had a significant impression on me to start the game, and it just kept me wanting to play and discover more. Discovering the world, or our world here really is the mines, that was also a big part of my initial experience. Every new hallway was very interesting to me, and knowing that the world is at least partially procedurally generated, it had me feeling excited to explore my unique world and what it had to offer. One of my concerns, though, going into the game partially based on my experience playing LOTRO really, was that I would get tired of being stuck in a natureless, lightless cave the entire time in the game. But there are a few areas that I have already gotten to in my playtime that they get windowed, or at least mirrored, sunlight and a decent bit of flora, and actually even some fauna. So on top of wolves, there are rats, and there are even some other animals. For this video, I'm not going to question on how all these animals got here, but there's also bears and deer, which these, even if they might seem out of place at first, even to me, they just help fill the world out and they make it less of a depressing cave experience. Building, on the other hand, that has been a mixed bag for me. It is satisfying to build crafting facilities, structures, and little dwarf box homes, but there are some, or a lot of limitations really with building. I am a little bit conflicted about these limitations. So with building angles, in particular there, you are bound by 90 degrees of rotation at a time. This can be nice for ensuring things are all square and you don't end up with things that are off or at funky angles, which really could bother me, but it does mean that things can only face one of 4 directions. What happens if the area that you want to build in is askew from that direction? Well, you're just out of luck is the reality. It was particularly annoying. I found this really beautiful house area where the building angles were just slightly off of the indestructible structure, so I couldn't actually destroy these things, and things weren't lining up for me. So all this left me both dissatisfied and honestly annoyed at the whole ordeal. At this point, I had to question why was the entire structure not destroyable so I could just create my own. Like it was just simple wood boards at the bottom for the floor that I just couldn't destroy. And there were other kind of random elements like that that seemed like they should have been perfectly destroyable, but I could not. And if I was able to destroy all that, I could have just created my own structure and I wouldn't have had to worry about these angles that wouldn't line up with what was there in the world and not destroyable. And then the other question is, setting all that aside, is why was it just ever so slightly askew to begin with, so it did not line up with our limited building angles? If they just rotated the entire housing structure just slightly, it would have worked perfectly and everything would have lined up and this wouldn't have been a problem. So if you cannot tell, that was probably the most annoying thing I ran into in my first play session. But in other areas where things actually do line up, building works very well, and it's actually quite the snappy process. I, of course, only have like 6 or 7 hours of gameplay at this point, so I have presumably limited building capabilities. Those are the other limitations. There are a few things that it seems like I should be able to build at this point that I can't, like stairs. Slanted ramps that could be used either as actual ramps to go up and down or as something like a roof, so I don't have a box house. Or just like there's also things like pillars or columns, like structural things like that I don't have access to yet. So things are feeling a bit limited there, but I'm anticipating a lot of that I'll get access to new things later. But otherwise, again, building has been fun, and I am looking forward to eventually creating a cozy dwarf cottage to call home sometime soon. Or am I? Well, you see, another negative part of the game has been the continuous single path progression. At this point, the game is really just pushing me to just move forward and forward and forward and not really set up a base camp. Instead, it encourages you, it seems, to set up little temporary mini camps along the way while just progressing forward into Moria and just delving deeper. This is not really an inherent flaw of the game design, but I would prefer to be able to settle down and feel like I can actually build an area to call home that I can always return to, and the area eventually, like a dwarf village or fortress or whatever it may be, that area has everything I need whenever I go out to delve further into Moria. So the lack of a permanent camp to call home leaves me anxious with moving forward, to be honest. I think this is at least partially why I have been progressing slowly for my last hour or so of gameplay in my solo world. I do know, though, that you can unlock these waystone things to port to and from, so maybe I just need to be patient and accept my homelessness for now, and in the future I'll actually be able to have a home. So, building here has been a mixed bag for me so far, but what about destroying things? I do love that a lot of these structures are destroyable, from random walls, old buildings, goblin structures, rubble. All that stuff is destroyable, which is very nice. But for 3D destruction and mining, well, there are also these areas of rocks that you can dig through for ores and resources, or just to discover new locations. But that's kind of it. I honestly expected the world to be a lot more destructible. These rock areas are kind of sparse, really, and the vast majority of the halls that you go through are just completely indestructible. It is possible that this is just the nature of the early parts of the game and the world is more fully destructible later. But right now, it leaves a lot of mining to be desired, and from what I've gathered from others' reports, all of the stone that lines most of the halls is just never destructible, even with better tools. That's something I thought at first, maybe I just need better tools and then I can destroy it, but right now, I think that's just a bit disappointing to me, at least based on my expectations. Again, I didn't think this would be like Minecraft going in, where it's a sandbox and you can destroy practically everything, but I did think there would be a lot more free and open mining and digging. But what all this has made RTM feel like to me is a survival RPG that is very linear and forward progression focused rather than an open world digging, gathering, and building type game. I've done way more combat than digging so far. I've also done way more combat than building, done more combat than basically anything in this game. And that actually seems a bit backwards from what I remember early advertisements of the game promoting. And this might sound super negative at this point, but I would actually say if I reorient my own thinking to what the game actually is instead of what I had expected, again, not knowing anything going into the game, I kind of just built up these own expectations in my mind from early promotions, and I was following the development of the game at least. But it actually does a great job at what it seems to be doing with pushing you forward deeper into Moria and just keep on the path of progression. Head straight down, straight forward, don't think about building a home. If instead of thinking about building homes, you just set up temporary camps and keep exploring and delving, then I think you may have a better starter experience than I did, at least in terms of how like building and progression works. Story-wise, again, to avoid spoilers, I have basically hinted at the linearity of the story throughout this video, and especially here. It seems to be very linear, so you go point A, point B, point C, all in a row, and so on going forward. I personally tend to not quite enjoy that type of story progression, especially for an adventuring game that includes all the things that Return to Moria does with gathering, crafting, and building. But the RTM story and progression is very linear so far. Again, that might change later, or maybe you get finished with like whatever the overarching story is, and then it's all like fully open for you to just build whatever you want. All of that, at least for me, remains to be discovered at this point. And here, while I have highlighted a few negative experiences and downsides that I have picked up on my first few hours of gameplay, my overall experience has not been that way. The reason I share these downsides in such great detail here is because I am already passionate and care about this game and future experiences in it. I would not actually care so much if the game was not fun and did not make me excited to play it. So moving forward, to me, what really matters at the end of the day here is that I just want to play the game a lot more. It has been incredibly fun, and I am excited to explore what else RTM's Moria has to offer. There is so much more to discover, and I am all here for it. Just like I am excited to discover what thoughts you all have to offer in the comments section. Let me know if you've played and if you are enjoying the game or not. If you have not bought the game yet and you are interested in it, then again, you could also consider using my creator code Louis7 in the Epic Games Store when you do purchase it. This is my first time advertising something like this, but I really would appreciate it as it does help support me moving forward. And if you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content, and thanks for watching, everyone.